There comes a moment in every man's life when everything he's built turns to ash before his eyes. For 70-year-old Eli Turner, that moment came when a wildfire consumed his mountain cabin, his workshop, and every memory he'd treasured for 40 years. Most folks would have given up right there, but Eli wasn't most folks. With nothing left but his loyal dog Buck, he walked into the Colorado wilderness and disappeared. His family thought he'd gone off to die. For 3 years, they heard nothing. Then his worried daughter finally rode up the mountain to find him, expecting the worst. What she discovered in that limestone cave high above the timberline shocked her to her core. It wasn't just shelter Eli had built. It was something far more extraordinary. But how does a man with nothing create something that would bring his estranged family to tears? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years before the fire changed everything, Eli Turner's mornings began the same way they had for nearly 4 decades. The sun would creep over the eastern peaks of the Colorado Rockies, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and he would wake to the gentle thump of Buck's tail against the wooden floor. The old blue-tick hound had claimed his spot beside Eli's bed years ago, and neither man nor dog saw any reason to change what worked. Eli's cabin sat at 8,000 feet, carved into a natural clearing where ancient pines gave way to a meadow that caught the morning light like a cupped palm. Martha had chosen this spot back in 1885, when they were both young and foolish enough to think love could conquer altitude sickness and winter storms that could bury a man's roof. She'd been right, mostly. They'd conquered everything but time itself. The cabin bore the marks of 40 years of careful tending. Every log had been selected by Eli's own hands, cut and fitted with the precision of a man who understood that shortcuts in mountain country could mean the difference between warmth and death. The chinking between the logs was fresh each autumn, mixed with clay from the creek bed and horsehair when he could get it. The roof, steep-pitched to shed the heavy snows, was shingled with hand-split cedar that had aged to the color of pewter. Inside, the cabin breathed with the accumulated warmth of decades. Martha's quilts still covered their bed, though she'd been gone these past 5 years. Her rocking chair sat by the stone fireplace, positioned to catch both the fire's warmth and the view through the south-facing window. Eli had built that fireplace, stone by stone, each rock chosen for its fit and durability. The mantelpiece was a single piece of pine, smooth as silk from years of Martha's careful polishing. The kitchen occupied the cabin's eastern wall, where Martha could catch the morning light for her cooking. Eli had fashioned the cabinets from local aspen, their pale wood brightening even the darkest winter days. The cookstove, a massive iron beast he'd hauled up the mountain piece by piece, dominated the corner. It took most of a day to assemble, but it had been heating their home and cooking their meals ever since. Eli's workshop occupied a separate building, 20 paces from the main cabin. Here lived the tools of his trade, chisels and planes worn smooth by his hands, saws that held their edge because he respected them, and hand tools passed down from his father. The workshop smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, honest scents that spoke of work done right the first time. Every surface held some project in various stages of completion, a chair being joined, a table being sanded, shelves waiting for their final coat of finish. This was where Eli's reputation had been built, one careful piece at a time. Folks came from as far as Denver for his furniture, drawn by craftsmanship that seemed to belong to an earlier, more patient age. He worked with hand tools mostly, believing that machines, for all their speed, could never match the understanding that came through touch. His fingers could read wood grain like other men read newspapers, finding the hidden stresses and natural curves that would make each piece both beautiful and enduring. Buck was his constant companion in the workshop, content to lie in a patch of sunlight while wood shavings accumulated around his graying muzzle. The dog had appeared at their door 8 years ago, half-starved and bearing the scars of some encounter with either man or beast. Martha had fed him soup bones and fresh biscuits, and Buck had repaid their kindness with devotion that bordered on worship. He was getting old now, his once powerful frame softened by age and good living, but his eyes still held the alertness of a dog who'd learned early that survival meant staying watchful. The morning routine rarely varied. Eli would stoke the fire while Buck padded outside for his morning patrol of the property. Coffee came next, strong and black, brewed in the same blue enamel pot Martha had brought to their marriage. While it steeped, Eli would step onto the covered porch to check the weather and survey his small kingdom. From the porch, he could see the entire meadow that surrounded their homestead. To the north, the peaks rose in serrated ranks, their summits white with snow that never entirely melted. South lay the gentler slopes that led, eventually, to the valley towns where civilization made its compromises with the wilderness. East and west, the mountains rolled away in forested waves that seemed to go on forever. This view had shaped every day of their marriage. Martha would join him here with her own cup of coffee, and they would plan their day while watching the light move across the meadow. In spring, they discussed the garden and where to plant this year's crops. Summer mornings were for planning haying and woodcutting, the endless tasks that prepared them for winter's siege. Autumn brought talk of hunting and the final preparations that would see them through the cold months. Winter mornings were quieter, focused inward on the warmth they'd created and the life they'd built together. After Martha's passing, these morning vigils had become Eli's private communion with memory. He would stand in the exact spot where she used to join him, sometimes speaking aloud to her as if she might still be listening. Buck seemed to understand these moments and would settle himself at Eli's feet, offering the silent companionship that had become his gift. The isolation of their mountain home was both blessing and challenge. Their nearest neighbors lived 12 miles down a rough track that became impassable in winter. The town of Cedar Falls lay another 8 miles beyond. That, a collection of buildings that served the scattered ranches and mines of the region. Eli made the trip to town, perhaps once a month during good weather, sometimes less in winter, carrying finished furniture to trade for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. This self-sufficiency had been Martha's dream as much as his. She'd grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a banker who couldn't understand why she'd chosen to marry a carpenter and follow him into the mountains. But Martha had possessed a pioneer's heart beneath her city manners, and she'd taken to mountain life with a determination that impressed even the old-timers. She'd learned to preserve meat and vegetables, to spin wool and weave cloth, to treat injuries and illnesses with herbs gathered from the mountainsides. Her root cellar, dug into the hillside behind the cabin, could feed them through the longest winter. Her smokehouse produced hams and bacon that other folks said rivaled anything from back east. Her garden, carved from the thin mountain soil, and protected from deer by a fence Eli had built to Martha's exacting specifications, provided vegetables that somehow thrived despite the short growing season. Now, 5 years after losing her, Eli maintained these systems as much from habit as necessity. The garden still produced its bounty each summer, though he found himself preserving smaller quantities. The smokehouse still filled with meat each fall, though he missed Martha's touch with the seasonings. He'd learned her methods through observation and necessity, but his results lacked the artistry she'd brought to even the simplest tasks. His relationship with his children had grown strained over the years, particularly after Martha's death. Sarah, their daughter, lived in Denver with her husband and 2 children Eli barely knew. She'd inherited her mother's strong will, but channeled it into a life that seemed to have no room for an aging father who insisted on living in what she called the middle of nowhere. James, their son, had moved to California years ago, chasing opportunities that the mountains couldn't provide. He wrote occasionally, dutiful letters that spoke of success in business ventures Eli didn't entirely understand. Both children had pressed him to sell the homestead after Martha's funeral, to move closer to family, or at least to town, where help would be available if needed. They couldn't understand that the cabin wasn't just his home. It was the physical manifestation of everything he and Martha had built together. Every hand-hewn beam, every carefully fitted stone, every piece of furniture told the story of their life together. To abandon it would be to abandon her memory, and that was something Eli simply couldn't do. Buck seemed to sense his master's thoughts during these quiet mornings. The old dog would lean against Eli's leg, offering wordless comfort that somehow eased the weight of solitude. They'd developed their own language over the years, a system of looks and gestures that served them better than words. Buck knew when Eli was heading to the workshop and would take his customary place in the sunshine. He knew when Eli was planning to check the boundary markers and would fetch his own enthusiasm for a day's hike. Most importantly, he knew when Eli needed simple companionship and would provide it without question or judgment. The workshop continued to be Eli's refuge and purpose. Orders came in regularly, passed along by word of mouth, and the kind of reputation that couldn't be bought. With advertising, a dining set for a family in Colorado Springs, rocking chairs for a couple expecting their first grandchild, custom cabinets for a new house being built down in the valley. Each commission was approached with the same care, the same attention to detail that had built his reputation over 4 decades. Working with his hands had always been Eli's way of thinking through problems, and the repetitive motions of planing and sanding provided a meditation that cleared his mind of everything but the immediate task. Wood was honest material. It would tell you its secrets if you knew how to listen, and it would punish carelessness with splits and breaks that couldn't be hidden or ignored. This honesty appealed to Eli in a way that human relationships, with their hidden motivations and unspoken expectations, sometimes did not. As autumn approached in what would prove to be his final year at the cabin, Eli found himself working with unusual intensity. Buck noticed it too, the way his master stayed later in the workshop, the way he seemed driven to complete projects that could easily wait for spring. Perhaps some instinct warned him that time was running short, though he couldn't have imagined the form that change would take. The hand-carved walking stick that had accompanied him on countless mountain trails leaned against the workshop wall, worn smooth by decades of use. Martha had given it to him on their 10th anniversary, commissioning a local craftsman to carve their initials and wedding date into the head. The stick had been his companion on hunting trips and boundary surveys, on lonely walks after Martha's death when grief made the cabin feel too small to contain his sorrow. Now, in these final peaceful months before the fire, the stick seemed to represent everything stable and enduring about his mountain life. Like the cabin itself, like his relationship with Buck, like the rhythm of seasons that had governed his existence for 40 years, the walking stick was a tangible connection to continuity in a world that seemed increasingly given to change. The last normal evening of Eli's old life ended as so many others had, with Buck settled beside the fireplace and Eli reading by lamplight in Martha's chair. Outside, an early September wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. The fire crackled softly, burning wood that Eli had cut and split the previous autumn. Everything was as it should be, peaceful and ordered and familiar. He had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, every physical reminder of this life would be reduced to ash and memory. The fire started 40 miles to the southwest on a Tuesday morning in late September, sparked by lightning from a dry thunderstorm that brought no rain. Eli first noticed the smoke on Wednesday evening, a thin grey column rising from beyond the southern ridges. He'd seen plenty of fires in his 40 years on the mountain, and this one looked manageable, too far away to threaten his homestead, contained by natural fire breaks he knew well. Buck sensed something wrong before Eli did. The old dog paced the cabin that night, whining softly and pressing his nose against the windows. When Eli let him out for his final patrol, Buck stood rigid on the porch, his graying muzzle lifted to test the wind. The air carried more than the usual scent of pine and cooling earth. Underneath lay something else, the bitter tang of distant burning. By Thursday morning, the smoke had thickened into a brown haze that hung between the peaks like fog. Eli climbed to the highest point on his property, a rocky outcrop that gave him a view across 30 miles of wilderness. What he saw made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. The fire had grown overnight, spreading east along the ridge systems that channeled wind like giant bellows. Worse, the weather had shifted. The wind that had been blowing the fire away from his mountain was now swinging around to the north. He spent Thursday preparing for a siege he'd fought before and won. The roof gutters were cleared of pine needles and debris. Ladder and buckets were positioned around the cabin. The gasoline-powered pump that drew water from the creek was tested and retested. Martha's garden was soaked until the ground couldn't hold another drop. The workshop, more vulnerable because of its contents, received special attention. Eli moved his most precious tools to the root cellar and covered everything else with wet canvas. Buck followed him through these preparations with unusual intensity, as if he understood that their peaceful life hung in the balance. The dog had lived through 2 previous fire seasons, and some deep instinct told him this one was different. He stayed close to Eli's heels, reluctant to let his master out of sight, even for the few minutes it took to climb onto the roof. Friday brought news that confirmed Eli's worst fears. His battery radio, usually silent except for weather reports, crackled with emergency broadcasts. The fire had jumped 2 major ridges during the night, driven by winds that gusted to 60 miles per hour. Evacuation orders were being issued for the entire southern slope of the mountain range. Residents were advised to leave immediately, but leaving wasn't a simple matter for Eli. His truck, a reliable Ford that had served him for 15 years, was down at the main road where he'd left it after his last trip to town. The trail from the cabin was too narrow and steep for vehicles, passable only on foot or horseback. Under normal circumstances, the 2-mile hike to the truck was nothing more than a pleasant walk. Now, with fire approaching and Buck too old for such a journey, the distance seemed like an impossible gulf. He tried calling Sarah from the old rotary phone that connected him to the outside world, but the line was dead. The phone company's equipment, vulnerable to both fire and the utility crews need to protect their workers, had probably been shut down hours ago. The radio continued its urgent broadcasts, but they seemed to come from another world, a place where people had cars in their driveways and neighbors close enough to help. By Friday evening, the fire was visible from Eli's porch. Red light flickered against the smoke-dark sky, and the wind carried ash that settled on everything like grey snow. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees as the massive fire created its own weather system, pulling air from all directions to feed its appetite. Eli knew from experience that fires this large developed their own logic, jumping miles in a single gust of wind or racing through treetops faster than any man could run. He made his decision as Martha would have expected, practical, determined, and focused on what mattered most. He couldn't save everything, but he could try to save the cabin. The workshop was more vulnerable, and if the fire reached it, those 40 years of accumulated tools and half-finished projects would disappear in minutes. But the cabin, built with massive logs and positioned in the center of the cleared meadow, had a fighting chance. Saturday dawned orange and sulphurous. The sun filtered through smoke so thick it seemed like twilight at noon. The fire was close. Enough now that individual flames were visible among the trees on the far side of the valley. Eli could hear it too, a sound like a freight train mixed with the roar of a massive waterfall. Trees were exploding in the heat, sending showers of sparks across the natural fire breaks that had protected his homestead for decades. Buck stayed pressed against Eli's legs as they worked through the morning, his usual confidence replaced by a terror he couldn't understand or escape. The old dog had faced bears and mountain lions with courage, but fire was an enemy beyond his comprehension. All he knew was that his master was afraid, and that fear infected him like a disease. The workshop went first. Just after noon, a wall, a flame 60 feet high, swept down the ridge like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Eli watched from the cabin's porch as 40 years of his life's work disappeared in less than 10 minutes. The carefully seasoned lumber, the hand tools passed down from his father, the half-finished rocking chair he'd been building for Sarah's daughter, all of it transformed into smoke and memory in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. Cabin held longer, protected by the fire break Eli had cut years ago and the green lawn Martha had insisted on planting around the building. He stood on the roof with a garden hose, spraying down the shingles as burning embers fell like deadly snow. Buck cowered beneath the porch steps, the only shelter he could find from the terrible heat and noise. For 2 hours, the battle was even. The cabin's metal roof shed sparks that would have ignited wooden shingles. The cleared space around the building kept the main fire at bay. Eli's steady stream of water prevented any embers from taking hold. He began to think he might actually save their home. Then the wind shifted one final time, and the fire found the weakness in his defenses. A gust stronger than any before, it carried burning debris across the firebreak and into the pine that stood too close to the cabin's north wall. The tree had been Martha's favorite, chosen to shade the kitchen window during summer afternoons. Now it became the fire's pathway to their home. Eli felt the moment of defeat like a physical blow. The cabin's north wall caught fire despite his efforts, and once the logs began burning, no amount of water could stop what came next. The structure that had sheltered them through 40 winters became fuel for the same flames that had consumed everything else. He climbed down from the roof as the fire spread to the main supporting beams. Buck emerged from his hiding place, whimpering, and pressing against Eli's legs. Together they stood in the meadow and watched their life disappear into smoke and flame. The rocking chair where Martha had spent countless evenings, the kitchen table where they'd shared 40 years of meals and conversations, the bed where they'd loved and argued and comforted each other through life's uncertainties. The heat drove them back, step by step, until they stood at the meadow's edge with their backs to the forest. Eli carried nothing but his walking stick and the clothes he wore. Buck's only possessions were his collar and the trust he'd placed in his master to keep them both safe. As the sun set through smoke that turned the sky the color of dried blood, Eli Turner stood amid the ruins of everything he'd built and loved. The cabin was gone. The workshop was gone. 40 years of memories had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. At 70 years old, with winter approaching and no shelter except what he could build with his own hands, he faced a choice that would define whatever time remained to him. Most men his age would have walked down to the road, flagged down a rescue vehicle, and accepted whatever charity or assistance was offered. Most men would have called it enough, would have surrendered to age and circumstance and the reasonable argument that some losses can't be overcome. But as Buck pressed against, his legs and the night wind scattered embers across the blackened ground, Eli Turner discovered that he wasn't most men. In Martha's wedding ring, now melted and misshapen among the cabin's ruins, lay the catalyst for everything that would follow. The fire had taken his past, but it had also freed him from any obligation to live as others expected. The wilderness that had threatened to overwhelm him now offered the only refuge that mattered. With Buck at his side and 40 years of hard-won knowledge in his head, Eli Turner turned his back on the ruins of his old life and walked into the darkness of the mountains. The first night after the fire, Eli and Buck huddled beneath a granite overhang 2 miles from the smoking ruins of their home. The old dog trembled against his master's side, not from cold, but from the shock of losing everything familiar. Eli wrapped his jacket around Buck's shoulders and tried to ignore the way his own hands shook as the reality of their situation settled. They had no food except the half-eaten sandwich Eli had abandoned on the porch when the fire reached the workshop. No water except what they could find in mountain streams. No shelter except what the wilderness might offer. Most crucially, they had no plan beyond surviving until morning and figuring out what came next. The walking stick that had guided Eli through countless mountain trails now served a more desperate purpose. He used it to test the stability of rocks before sitting, to probe the darkness for safe footing when they'd moved away from the fire's glow. Martha's anniversary gift had become a tool for basic survival, its familiar weight in his hand, offering the only continuity between his old life and whatever lay ahead. Buck refused to leave Eli's side that first night, pressing so close that the old man could feel every tremor that ran through the dog's body. The blue-tick hound had always been brave, but courage meant nothing against an enemy that could consume entire mountainsides. Fire was beyond any animal's understanding, a force that violated every instinct about what was safe and what was dangerous. Dawn brought a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Where green forest had covered the mountainside, black skeletal trees reached toward a sky still hazed with drifting smoke. The fire had moved on, chasing the wind toward other valleys, but it had left behind a moonscape of ash and devastation. Eli could barely recognize landmarks he'd known for 40 years. The creek that had supplied their cabin still ran clear, fed by springs too deep for the fire to reach. Eli and Buck drank deeply, the cold mountain water cutting through the smoke taste that coated their throats. This water had been their lifeline for decades, and now it would have to sustain them through whatever came next. Finding food became the first priority. Eli's knowledge of edible plants, learned during hunting trips and wilderness excursions with Martha, would have to substitute for the well-stocked pantry now reduced to ash. Late-season berries still clung to bushes that had escaped the fires. Wild onions grew near the creek banks. Pine nuts could be harvested from the few trees the fire had missed. Buck's hunting instincts, dormant during years of comfortable retirement, slowly awakened as hunger drove both man and dog to remember older skills. The blue tick's nose, bred for tracking, began picking up scent trails that led to small game, rabbits and squirrels that had survived the fire by staying near water and rocky areas where the flames couldn't penetrate. But winter was coming, and Eli knew that berries and small game wouldn't sustain them through months of snow and sub-zero temperatures. The easy survival of late summer would give way to conditions that had claimed the lives of younger, better-equipped men. They needed shelter that could withstand mountain storms, and they needed it soon. On their third day in the wilderness, while following the creek upstream toward its source, Eli discovered what would become their salvation. Hidden behind a screen of boulders that had shielded it from the fire's worst fury, a limestone cave opened into the mountainside like a mouth frozen in surprise. The entrance was narrow enough that Buck had to squeeze through, but inside, the cavern opened into a space large enough to shelter a dozen men. The cave extended back into the mountain farther than Eli's matches could illuminate. Ancient water had carved chambers and passages through the limestone, creating a natural architecture that spoke of geological time measured in millennia rather than the human decades that had governed Eli's previous life. The air inside was cool and dry, protected from wind and weather by countless tons of solid rock. More importantly, the cave showed signs of previous human habitation. Blackened stones near the entrance marked where someone had built fires long ago. Pictographs scratched into the limestone walls suggested that indigenous peoples had used this shelter for generations before white settlers arrived in the valley. The knowledge that others had survived here before them gave Eli the first hope he'd felt since watching his cabin burn. Buck explored the cave's depths with growing enthusiasm, his fear finally giving way to curiosity about their new territory. The dog's tail wagged for the first time since the fire as he investigated scents and sounds that spoke of small animals who'd made the cave system their home. Here was prey that could be caught, territory that could be defended, a place where survival seemed possible rather than merely desperate. That first night in the cave, Eli built a small fire using techniques Martha had learned from old-timers who remembered the frontier days. Dry pine needles and birch bark provided tinder. Small twigs caught quickly in the flames. Larger branches, gathered from areas the fire had missed, would burn through the night and provide both warmth and protection from any predators who might be drawn by the scent of smoke. The fire's light danced across limestone walls that had witnessed countless such scenes over thousands of years. Eli felt the weight of history in this place, the accumulated presence of everyone who had sought shelter here before him. He wasn't the first man to lose everything and retreat into the wilderness. He wouldn't be the last to discover that survival required abandoning everything civilized society claimed was necessary for human existence. Buck curled up beside the fire, finally relaxed enough to sleep deeply. The dog's steady breathing and the crackling of burning wood created a soundtrack that spoke of safety and continuity. Outside, the wind moved through the burned forest with a sound like mourning. But inside the cave, warmth and light held back the darkness. As the fire settled into glowing coals, Eli began to understand that they had found more than temporary shelter. The cave offered everything they needed to survive: protection from weather, space to store supplies, natural water sources, and access to hunting grounds that could provide food throughout the winter. More than that, it offered something his. Cabin had never possessed, complete independence from the world that had let him down. His children had wanted him to abandon the mountain life that Martha had loved. His neighbors had assumed he would give up after losing everything to the fire. Society expected him to accept charity and assistance, to acknowledge that a man his age couldn't survive alone in the wilderness. The cave represented his answer to all those expectations, a place where he could prove that some things couldn't be taken away by fire or time or other people's assumptions about what was possible. The walking stick leaned against the cave wall, its carved surface reflecting the firelight. Martha's anniversary gift had guided him to this place, just as her memory would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. In losing everything they had built together, Eli had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: the chance to discover what he was truly capable of when everything else was stripped away. The cave would become their home. But first, it would test every skill and every ounce of determination they possessed. Winter was coming, and survival would require rebuilding not just shelter, but an entire way of life from whatever materials the wilderness provided. The first weeks in the cave taught Eli lessons that 40 years of mountain living had never required. Building a cabin was one thing. Working with milled lumber and modern tools, following plans drawn on paper, creating something that matched a vision held in his mind. Transforming a raw cave into livable space demanded different skills entirely, the kind of improvisation that frontier settlers had practiced, but that his generation had largely forgotten. Every improvement began with salvage. The fire had destroyed his home, but scattered useful materials across the mountainside. Twisted metal from the cabin's roof could be straightened and shaped into tools. Nails and screws, discolored by heat, but still functional, lay among the ashes waiting to be collected. Glass from broken windows, though cracked and sharp-edged, could be fitted into frames to create rudimentary barriers against wind and weather. Buck proved invaluable during these scavenging expeditions. The old dog's nose could locate metal buried under ash and debris, leading Eli to treasures he would have missed searching by sight alone. More importantly, Buck's presence provided motivation for the exhausting work of hauling materials up the steep trail to the cave. A man might give up when his back ached and his hands bled from handling sharp metal. A man with a dog depending on him kept working until the job was done. The cave's entrance became Eli's first construction project. Wind-driven snow would make the shelter uninhabitable unless he could control the elements that entered. Using salvaged lumber and stones gathered from the creek bed, he began building a wall that would close off the cave's mouth while still allowing access and ventilation. The work was slow and demanding, each stone carefully selected for size and shape, each piece of wood measured and fitted by hand. Winter announced its approach with temperatures that dropped below freezing even during daylight hours. Eli had survived many mountain winters, but always with the security of a heated cabin, stocked pantry, and ready access to town if supplies ran low. Now he faced the cold, with nothing but what he could gather, build, or catch with his own hands. The urgency of preparation drove him to work from dawn to dusk, racing against weather that would stop all progress once snow began falling in earnest. Food preservation became a daily obsession. Small game caught in snares had to be cleaned, butchered and dried quickly before spoilage set in. Wild berries were gathered and stored in containers salvaged from the cabin's ruins. Pine nuts were harvested and cached in dry corners of the cave where they would remain edible through the winter months. Every calorie had to be collected and protected against the lean times ahead. Buck adapted to their new life with surprising resilience. The old dog's hunting instincts, dormant during years of comfortable domesticity, slowly awakened as necessity demanded older skills. His tracking ability led them to rabbit runs and squirrel territories that provided steady sources of fresh meat. More importantly, his presence provided companionship that kept Eli anchored to hope during the darkest moments of doubt. The carved wooden bowl that Eli fashioned from a piece of salvaged pine became their most essential piece of equipment. Every meal was prepared and eaten from this single vessel, every drink of water or wild tea shared between man and dog. The bowl represented more than utility. It was proof that craftsmanship could survive even when all the proper tools were lost, that beauty could emerge from the simplest materials when guided by skilled hands and determined purpose. Creating this bowl required tools that didn't exist until Eli made them. A knife blade hammered from a piece of metal roofing, a handle wrapped in strips of leather cut from his belt. Sandpaper improvised from rough stones found along the creek bed. Each tool was crude by the standards of his former workshop, but adequate for the task at hand. The process taught him that sophistication was often less important than functionality, that the perfect could become the enemy of the essential. The bowl's smooth interior, shaped by patient scraping and sanding, held their first cooked meal. In the cave, a stew made from rabbit meat, wild onions, and pine nuts, seasoned with herbs Martha had taught him to identify during their walks together. The taste was simple but satisfying, proof that survival didn't require the elaborate preparations his former life had taken for granted. As autumn progressed toward winter, Eli discovered resources within the cave system that he hadn't initially recognized. A natural spring in one of the deeper chambers provided fresh water that never froze, no matter how cold the temperature outside. Clay deposits along an underground stream could be shaped into crude pottery and fired in his campfire to create waterproof containers. Natural shelves in the limestone walls offered storage space for the supplies they were gradually accumulating. Buck's favorite discovery was a chamber that opened through a crack barely wide enough for the dog to squeeze through. Inside, generations of pack rats had accumulated a treasure trove of shiny objects, buttons, coins, pieces of metal and glass that had been gathered and stored with the same obsessive care Eli was applying to their survival preparations. The dog would disappear into this chamber for hours, emerging with odd items that sometimes proved surprisingly useful. The nights grew longer and colder, but the cave remained comfortable thanks to thermal mass that stored heat from their fires and released it slowly through the dark hours. Eli learned to read the cave's moods, understanding how air currents moved through the limestone passages where smoke would vent naturally, which areas stayed warmest during the coldest weather. The cave was becoming more than shelter. It was developing into a home that responded to their needs and protected them from the mountain's harshest challenges. Sleep came easier, as exhaustion from constant labor overcame the discomfort of sleeping. On stone floors covered with pine boughs and salvaged fabric, Buck would curl against Eli's side, sharing body heat and providing the comfort of companionship that made solitude bearable. The dog's steady breathing and occasional dream whimpers became the lullaby that carried Eli into rest, a reminder that they were building something together rather than merely surviving alone. The wooden bowl sat beside their sleeping area each night, ready for whatever the next day might bring. Its simple presence represented everything they had accomplished and everything they still hoped to achieve. In its curved interior, Eli could see the reflection of firelight that spoke of warmth, security, and the possibility that even the greatest losses could be overcome by patience, skill, and the determination to keep building something better from whatever materials life provided. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks with a fury that reminded Eli why mountain. People respected the seasons above all else. The first major snowfall buried the burned forest under 3 feet of pristine white, transforming the blackened landscape into something almost beautiful. But beauty was a luxury Eli couldn't afford to contemplate when survival demanded every ounce of his attention. The cave entrance wall he'd built proved its worth during the first blizzard. Wind that would have turned their shelter into a frozen tomb was deflected and channeled, allowing them to maintain comfortable temperatures, even when the outside air dropped to 20 below zero. The thermal mass of the limestone stored heat from their fires and released it slowly through the long nights, creating a microclimate that made survival possible. Buck had grown a thick winter coat that would have made his former pampered life seem like a distant memory. The old dog moved through the snow with renewed purpose, his hunting instincts now fully awakened by months of necessity. He could track prey through conditions that would have baffled domestic pets, leading Eli to rabbits and ptarmigan that provided fresh meat when their stored supplies ran low. The deer hide Eli had been tanning since November became their most valuable possession as temperatures plummeted. The process of working the hide with improvised tools and brain-tanning solutions, made from materials found in the wilderness, had tested every skill Martha had taught him about traditional crafts. Now, properly cured and supple, the hide served as blanket, coat, and windbreak depending on their needs. This hide represented months of patient work, performed under conditions that would have defeated most men half Eli's age. Scraping away fat and tissue with stone knives, stretching and working the leather until it became soft and pliable, smoking it over carefully tended fires that required constant attention to maintain the right temperature and prevent scorching. Every step had been learned through trial and error, guided by half-remembered lessons from old-timers who had practiced these skills when they were necessities rather than hobbies. The hide's warmth made the difference between comfort and misery. During the coldest nights, wrapped in its soft embrace, with Buck pressed against his side and the fire burning steadily in their stone-lined hearth, Eli could almost forget that they were living in a cave miles from any other human presence. The hide carried the scent of wood smoke and mountain air, honest smells that spoke of work done with one's hands and survival earned through knowledge and determination. But winter also brought unexpected challenges that tested every assumption Eli had made about their situation. A series of warm days in January created conditions that sent snowmelt cascading through previously dry passages in the cave system. They woke one morning to find their main living area flooded with ice cold water that threatened to ruin their carefully accumulated supplies. The crisis forced them to relocate deeper into the cave system, carrying everything they owned through passages barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Buck followed with remarkable patience, understanding somehow that their survival depended on reaching higher, drier ground. In the depths of the limestone cavern, they found chambers that previous inhabitants had used for exactly this purpose. Natural refuges that remained dry even during the worst flooding. These deeper chambers revealed secrets that changed Eli's understanding of their shelter's history. Native American petroglyphs covered sections of the walls, depicting hunting scenes and astronomical observations that suggested this cave had been a significant site for generations before white settlers arrived in the valley. The artwork spoke of people who had not merely survived in this place, but had thrived here, developing sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns and resource management. More practically, the chambers contained caches left by previous inhabitants, stone, tools, pottery shards, and most importantly, seeds from plants that could be cultivated in mountain conditions. These discoveries suggested that the cave had been more than temporary shelter. It had been home to people who understood how to live sustainably in one of the continent's most challenging environments. Eli began to see patterns in the cave's layout that he had missed during their initial desperate search for shelter. Natural ventilation systems that drew fresh air through the limestone passages, water sources that remained unfrozen even during the coldest weather, storage areas positioned to take advantage of temperature variations that could preserve food without artificial refrigeration. The cave wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a complex environmental system that had supported human habitation for centuries. Buck seemed to understand the significance of these discoveries, exploring the ancient living areas with the same interest he had shown in their modern adaptations. The dog would sniff at spots where cooking fires had burned generations ago, his tail wagging as if he could still detect traces of meals shared by long-dead families. His enthusiasm reminded Eli that they were part of a tradition that stretched back to the beginning of human settlement in these mountains. The seed cache proved to be their most valuable discovery. Among the varieties preserved in clay pots sealed with pine pitch, Eli found species that could grow in short mountain seasons and poor soil conditions. Wild potatoes that could survive frost, beans that fixed nitrogen in soil too thin for other crops, squash varieties bred for cold tolerance and long storage life. These seeds represented generations of careful selection and preservation knowledge, passed down through cultures that understood survival in ways modern civilization had forgotten. Planning next year's garden, while snow still covered the ground, might have seemed premature, but Eli understood that mountain growing seasons left no room for delay. Every day spent preparing during winter would pay dividends. When the brief summer growing season arrived, the seeds would need to be started in the cave's warmest chambers, transplanted to outdoor plots prepared during the spring snowmelt, and tended carefully through the few months when growth was possible. The deer hide that had carried them through winter's worst storms would serve new purposes as the seasons changed. Cut into strips, it could provide ties and fastenings for garden tools and structures. Shaped into containers, it could hold water for irrigation. Crafted into protective covers, it could extend the growing season for delicate plants. Nothing could be wasted when survival depended on making the most of every available resource. As the days slowly began to lengthen and the worst cold started to ease, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced since the fire: genuine optimism about the future. They had not merely survived winter in the wilderness, they had discovered a way of life that connected them to something larger than their individual struggle. The cave held lessons that went beyond simple survival, teaching them about resilience, adaptation, and the deep satisfaction that came from living in harmony with natural systems rather than fighting against them. Spring arrived slowly to the high country, marked not by sudden warmth, but by subtle changes that only experienced mountain dwellers could read. The quality of light shifted first, losing winter's harsh clarity in favor of softer tones that spoke of snow beginning to loosen its grip on the peaks. Ice on the creek developed a different sound as flowing water underneath began to assert itself against winter's frozen tyranny. Buck noticed the changes before Eli did, his nose detecting scents that had been buried under snow for months. The old dog's energy increased noticeably as longer days awakened instincts that winter had held in check. He would stand at the cave entrance for longer periods, testing the air for messages carried on warming breezes from the valleys below. The garden site Eli had chosen during winter's depths revealed itself as snow melted away from the south-facing slope below the cave. The location offered everything the ancient seeds would need: well-drained soil protected from the worst winds, access to water from the creek, and maximum exposure to the brief mountain growing season's precious sunlight. More importantly, it was positioned where he could defend it against the deer and elk that would consider his crops a welcome supplement to their natural forage. Preparing the soil required tools that existed only in Eli's imagination until he created them. A digging stick fashioned from a straight pine branch and hardened in the fire. A hoe blade hammered from salvaged metal and hafted to a wooden handle. A rake improvised from branches bound together with strips of deer hide. Each tool was crude by civilized standards, but perfectly adapted to the specific challenges of mountain gardening. The stone axe head that Eli napped from flint, found along the creek, became his most prized implement as spring work intensified. Creating this tool had required skills he'd thought were lost to history, learned through patient experimentation and painful failures that left his hands cut and bleeding. But the finished axe, hafted to a strong wooden handle and bound with sinew, could fell trees and shape timber with efficiency that surprised even its maker. This axe represented more than functionality. It was proof that human ingenuity could recreate civilization's most essential tools, using nothing but raw materials and accumulated knowledge. Every blow that drove the stone blade into wood carried the weight of 10,000 years of human technological development, compressed into an implement that would have been familiar to the earliest inhabitants of these mountains. The work of expanding their living space consumed most of Eli's energy as the weather warmed enough to permit construction projects. The cave's natural chambers provided shelter, but creating truly comfortable living quarters required modification and improvement that tested every skill he possessed. Stone walls to divide spaces and control airflow, wooden floors to provide insulation from the limestone's perpetual chill, storage systems that would protect their possessions from moisture and vermin. Buck proved invaluable during construction, not just as companionship, but as an active helper whose intelligence had been sharpened by months of collaborative survival. The dog could fetch tools and materials without being shown what was needed, understanding through observation and repetition which items belonged to which tasks. More importantly, Buck's presence provided motivation for the exhausting work of moving stones and timber through narrow cave passages. The first seeds went into carefully prepared soil as soon as the last frost danger passed. Eli had started. Some varieties in small pots kept warm near the cave's fire, giving them a head start that would be crucial in the abbreviated growing season. Watching the first green shoots emerge from soil that had been frozen solid just weeks before provided a satisfaction that surpassed anything he'd felt during his years of comfortable cabin life. Each plant that survived and thrived represented a small victory against the forces that had tried to defeat them. The wild potatoes that emerged from carefully prepared hills, the beans that climbed improvised trellises made from gathered branches, the squash that spread across ground cleared and enriched with composted scraps from their winter meals. Every successful germination proved that they could not only survive in this place, but could create abundance from resources that others would consider inadequate. But spring also brought the first real test of Eli's resolve to remain hidden from the Outside world. A search party working the burned areas below their mountain found traces of their winter presence, footprints in mud near the creek, ashes from fires that had escaped complete concealment, disturbances in the forest that suggested human activity. The searchers were clearly looking for fire survivors, probably sent by Sarah or James after official rescue efforts had been called off. From a concealed position above the cave, Eli watched 3 men on horseback methodically working the valley floor. Their presence stirred emotions he'd thought were settled, longing for human contact, guilt over the worry he was causing his children, and uncertainty about whether his chosen isolation was wise or merely stubborn pride. Buck sensed his masters' conflict and pressed close, offering silent support that helped steady Eli's resolve. The decision to remain hidden while his own family searched for him required a hardness that surprised Eli with its intensity. These men represented everything he'd walked away from, well-meaning assistance that came with strings attached, expectations, that he should accept his limitations, assumptions about what was appropriate for a man his age. Revealing himself would mean explanations, arguments, and probably forced removal from the life he'd built through his own determination and skill. The search party moved on after 2 days of fruitless investigation, but their presence had changed. Something fundamental in Eli's relationship with his isolation. What had begun as desperate survival had evolved into conscious choice, and that choice carried moral weight that couldn't be ignored. He was no longer simply a fire victim struggling to stay alive. He was a man who had deliberately chosen to let his family believe he was dead rather than submit to their well-intentioned control. The stone axe leaned against the cave wall that night, its flint blade reflecting the firelight like a challenge to anyone who would question his decisions. The tool represented everything he'd accomplished through his own hands and will, proof that age didn't automatically mean helplessness, and that some kinds of strength could only be discovered by refusing the easy path of surrender. As Buck settled beside the fire with the contentment of a dog who knew his place in the world, Eli understood that they had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. They were no longer refugees from disaster. They were inhabitants of a chosen life that owed nothing to anyone else's expectations or assistance. 2 years had passed since the fire when Eli made the discovery that would redefine everything he thought he knew about his mountain sanctuary. The garden was thriving in its 2nd season. The cave had been transformed into comfortable living quarters, and Buck had settled into the rhythm of a life that seemed as natural as breathing. They had achieved something that bordered on paradise, complete self-sufficiency in one of the continent's most challenging environments. The discovery began with a sound that didn't belong in their carefully ordered world. Buck heard it first, his graying head lifting from his usual spot by the fire, ears pricked toward the deeper recesses of the cave system. The sound came again, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing from passages they had never fully explored. Eli followed Buck through limestone corridors they had mapped during their first winter, moving deeper into the mountain than they had ventured since the flood that drove them to higher chambers. The sound grew clearer as they descended, unmistakably the sound of metal striking stone. Someone else was in their cave system, working with tools in areas Eli had assumed were accessible only through the narrow entrance they used. The passage opened into a chamber, larger than any they had discovered before, its ceiling lost in shadows beyond the reach of Eli's pine torch. But it wasn't the chamber's size that stopped him cold. It was the evidence of recent human habitation scattered across the cave floor. Modern camping equipment, battery-powered lanterns, boxes of supplies that spoke of planning and resources, far beyond anything Eli and Buck possessed. A man emerged from a side passage, carrying a geology hammer and wearing clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to comfort rather than survival. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the soft look of someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands. His surprise at seeing Eli was complete and genuine, the shock of discovering that this remote cave system already had inhabitants. "My God," the stranger said, setting down his hammer with hands that trembled slightly. "I thought I was alone up here. I've been working these passages for 6 months and never saw any sign of—" He stopped, studying Eli's weathered appearance and improvised clothing. "You're him, aren't you? The mountain man they were looking for after the fire." "Turner, I think." The name was. Eli felt the careful foundations of his hidden life shifting beneath him like loose shale. This stranger knew who he was, which meant the outside world was closer than he had imagined. Worse, the man's presence in chambers Eli had never accessed suggested that their sanctuary had vulnerabilities they hadn't recognized. "I'm Dr. Marcus Webb," the stranger continued, extending a hand that Eli didn't take. "Geologist with the University of Colorado. I've been conducting mineral surveys in this cave system as part of a comprehensive study of the region's geological resources." Webb gestured toward the equipment scattered around the chamber. "I access these passages through an entrance on the north face of the mountain. I had no idea anyone else was using these caves." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. Their perfect isolation had been an illusion. While he and Buck had been creating their wilderness paradise, the outside world had been conducting scientific studies literally beneath their feet. The cave system was larger and more complex than he had imagined, with multiple entrances that could bring unwanted visitors at any time. But Webb's next words carried implications that dwarfed concerns about privacy. "I've been documenting significant mineral deposits throughout this cave system," the geologist explained, pulling out a tablet computer that seemed impossibly out of place in the primitive environment. "Copper, silver, and some rare earth elements that could be extremely valuable. The preliminary surveys suggest this could be one of the richest undeveloped mineral sites in the state." The crystal formation that Webb had been examining when Eli discovered him sparkled in the torchlight like captured starlight. Beautiful and alien, the crystals covered an entire wall of the chamber in geometric patterns that spoke of geological processes operating over millions of years. But to Webb, these natural sculptures represented something entirely different, economic potential that would transform the mountain into an industrial site. "The irony is remarkable," Webb continued, seemingly oblivious to the implications of his words. "This entire area was written off as worthless after the fire. The state's been considering selling the land to private developers for almost nothing, but my findings could change everything. If these mineral deposits prove as extensive as I believe, this mountain could support a major mining operation." Eli's walking stick, which had guided him through every step of his journey from civilized homesteader to wilderness survivor, now felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. The stick represented continuity and purpose, while Webb's presence threatened to destroy everything he and Buck had built. The mountain that had offered them refuge could become the site of industrial activity that would obliterate their carefully constructed life. "Of course, any development would have to account for environmental concerns," Webb said, apparently mistaking Eli's silence for interest rather than horror. "But the economic potential is enormous. Jobs for the valley communities, tax revenue for the state. This could be the most significant mineral discovery in Colorado in decades." Buck growled softly, a sound Eli had rarely heard from the normally peaceful dog. The blue-tick hound's instincts were warning him about threats that went beyond individual danger to encompass everything they valued about their mountain sanctuary. Buck understood that this soft-spoken stranger represented a form of destruction more complete than any wildfire. The crystal formation seemed to mock Eli's assumptions about security and permanence. He had thought that losing everything in the fire was the worst that could happen, but Webb's discovery revealed a threat far more devastating than mere personal tragedy. The government agencies and corporate interests that would descend on the Mountain, if Webb's surveys proved valuable, would not simply displace one old man and his dog. They would transform the entire landscape into something unrecognizable. "I assume you'll be moving on soon," Webb said, with the casual assumption of someone accustomed to having his expectations met. "I hate to disturb whatever arrangement you've made here, but once word of these mineral deposits gets out, this area is going to become very busy very quickly. You'll want to find somewhere more peaceful to settle." The assumption that Eli would simply abandon everything he'd built revealed how completely Webb misunderstood what was at stake. This wasn't a temporary camping situation that could be relocated at convenience. It was a home created through 2 years of exhausting labor, a way of life that couldn't be duplicated anywhere else, a sanctuary that had saved both man and dog from despair and death. Eli's silence stretched until Webb began to look uncomfortable, perhaps finally sensing that his discovery had created complications he hadn't anticipated. The geologist gathered his equipment with efficiency that spoke of extensive fieldwork experience, but his movements carried the nervous energy of someone who realized he'd stumbled into a situation beyond his understanding. "I'll be filing my preliminary report next week," Webb said, as he prepared to leave through the passage that had brought him into their world. "Environmental impact studies will probably take a year or two, but after that, development could move very quickly. You might want to consider your options while you still have them." As Webb's footsteps faded into the depths of the cave system, Eli remained motionless beside the crystal formation that had revealed their vulnerability. Buck pressed against his master's legs, offering comfort that couldn't address the magnitude of what they faced. In the space of a single conversation, their secure mountain refuge had been transformed into the target of forces that would stop at nothing to extract wealth from the earth. The walking stick that had carried Eli through. Every challenge since the fire now seemed inadequate for the battle ahead. Webb's discovery meant that survival would no longer be measured in terms of individual endurance, but in the ability to protect something precious against enemies with resources and legal authority far beyond anything one man could possess. The crystal formation glittered with beauty that would be destroyed by the mining equipment Webb's report would inevitably summon to the mountain. In its delicate structures, Eli could see everything he stood to lose and everything he would have to become to prevent that loss. The weeks following Webb's departure passed like the calm before a mountain storm, deceptively peaceful on the surface, while deeper currents gathered force for what was coming. Eli found himself unable to settle into the routines that had sustained him through 2 years of mountain living. Every sound from the cave's depths made him wonder if Webb had returned with colleagues or equipment. Every distant aircraft made him scan the sky for signs of aerial surveys that would map their sanctuary from above. Buck sensed his master's unease and began exhibiting behaviors that spoke of preparation for conflict. The old dog's patrols of their territory became more thorough and systematic, as if he were memorizing every trail and hiding place they might need in the days ahead. His hunting instincts, already sharpened by 2 years of wilderness living, developed a new edge that suggested he understood their peaceful existence was threatened. The first concrete sign of change came 3 weeks after Webb's visit, carried on the wind that swept up from the valleys below. The distant sound of helicopters, too regular and persistent to be simple transportation, spoke of systematic activity that could only mean one thing. Webb's preliminary report had triggered the kind of response that preceded major industrial development. Eli climbed to the highest vantage point accessible from their cave, a rocky ledge that offered views across 30 miles of wilderness. Through field glasses salvaged from his cabin's ruins, he could see aircraft moving in grid patterns across the burned areas below their mountain. Ground crews with specialized equipment were working their way up the access roads that had been built for fire suppression efforts. The machinery of modern resource extraction was deploying with efficiency that made his heart sink with recognition of what was coming. The bone fishing hook that Eli carved during those anxious days became both practical tool and symbol of the choices he faced. Fashioned from a deer leg bone with tools he'd made himself, the hook represented everything he'd learned about creating what was needed from whatever materials were available. But it also represented the fundamental question that haunted his days and disturbed his sleep. How much was he willing to sacrifice to protect what he'd built? The hook's simple curve, polished smooth by patient work with crude abrasives, captured the essence of their mountain life. Every tool they used, every structure they'd built, every skill they'd mastered had emerged from necessity and been perfected through practice. The fishing hook could provide food from streams that would run clear long after mining equipment had poisoned the groundwater, but only if those streams remained unpolluted by the industrial activity that Webb's discovery would inevitably bring to their mountain. As Eli tested the hook's strength and sharpness, he understood that it represented more than survival equipment. It was proof of human ability to live lightly on the land, taking only what was needed and leaving the essential. Systems intact for future generations. The hook could last for decades with proper care, providing sustainable harvest from waters that would remain clean only if the mountain's mineral wealth stayed buried where geological time had placed it. The strategic planning that consumed Eli's thoughts during those preparation weeks revealed options that ranged from retreat to resistance, each carrying costs he was reluctant to pay. He could gather their essential possessions and search for another remote sanctuary, abandoning everything they'd built but preserving their freedom to live as they chose. The mountains held other caves, other hidden valleys where a man and his dog could disappear beyond the reach of surveys and development plans, but leaving would mean admitting defeat to forces that had no right to destroy what others had created through honest labor and careful stewardship. More practically, it would mean starting over at an age when his strength was already beginning to diminish in terrain that might not offer the resources that had made survival possible in their current location. Buck was aging too, and the stress of another relocation might be more than the old dog could handle. The alternative to retreat was resistance, but fighting back against legal authority and corporate resources seemed like a battle that could only end in imprisonment or worse. Eli had no legal claim to land that belonged to the state, no standing to challenge decisions made by agencies with legislative mandate to manage public resources for economic benefit. A 72-year-old man living illegally in a cave could hardly expect sympathy from courts that measured value in tax revenue and job creation. Yet the more Eli studied their situation, the more he realized that conventional resistance might not be the only option available to someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain and unlimited commitment to defending it. The cave system was far more complex than Webb had realized during his initial surveys. Passages that appeared to dead end often continued through cracks too narrow for adults, openings that could be enlarged by someone with the right tools and sufficient motivation. The mountain held secrets that 2 years of careful exploration had only begun to reveal. Underground streams that connected chambers separated by miles of limestone corridors. Natural chimneys that provided ventilation to depths that conventional surveys couldn't access. Hidden entrances that could be used for movement without detection by surface-based monitoring equipment. Webb's geological knowledge was extensive, but it couldn't match the detailed understanding that came from living in intimate daily contact with the landscape. Buck's behavior during their reconnaissance expeditions suggested that the dog understood. They were preparing for something more serious than their usual survival activities. The blue-tick hound moved with a stealth that spoke of hunting instincts adapted to circumstances where detection could mean death. His ability to navigate the cave system in complete darkness, using senses that humans couldn't match, would be invaluable if their resistance required movement through passages where artificial light would reveal their position. The fishing hook seemed almost absurdly simple compared to the sophisticated equipment the geological surveys required, but simplicity carried advantages that Eli was beginning to appreciate. His improvised tools couldn't be tracked by radio signals or detected by metal detectors. They required no batteries, spare parts, or technical support that could be interrupted by hostile forces. Most importantly, they could be replaced or repaired, using materials that would remain available, even if supply lines from the outside world were completely severed. The moral weight of his situation became clearer as Eli recognized that the choice between retreat and resistance wasn't really about his personal comfort or convenience. The mountain sanctuary that had saved his life represented something larger than individual survival. It was proof that human beings could live sustainably in landscapes that industrial civilization considered worthless until valuable minerals were discovered beneath the surface. Webb's mineral survey had revealed wealth that would be extracted once and exhausted within decades, leaving behind environmental damage that would persist for centuries. The alternative use of the landscape as sanctuary for wildlife, watershed protection for downstream communities, and demonstration that sustainable living remained possible even in challenging environments, would provide benefits that could last indefinitely if protected from industrial exploitation. The decision crystallized for Eli as he sat beside their evening fire, with Buck curled against his side and the bone-fishing hook balanced in his weathered hands. Retreat would save their individual lives, but would abandon the mountain to forces that recognized only economic value. Resistance would risk everything they'd built, but it would also defend principles that transcended personal survival. The hook's smooth curve caught the firelight like a question mark, reminding Eli that some decisions couldn't be made through rational calculation of odds and outcomes. Martha would have understood the choice he was facing. She'd been the one who insisted they build their life in a place where values mattered more than convenience, where the quality of existence was measured by harmony with natural systems rather than accumulation of material possessions. Outside the cave, autumn wind moved through the few trees that had survived the fire, carrying the scent of snow from peaks that would soon be white with winter's return. The seasonal cycle that had governed their mountain life for 2 years would continue, regardless of human plans and surveys. But whether that cycle would include the sanctuary they'd created depended on choices that would have to be made in the days ahead. The bone-fishing hook represented everything Eli valued about their mountain existence: simplicity, sustainability, and proof that human ingenuity could create abundance without destroying the systems that made life possible. As he placed the finished hook in his kit of survival tools, he understood that he was preparing not just for physical conflict, but for a battle over the soul of the landscape that had given him a reason to keep living when everything else had been reduced to ash. The preparations that would determine whether their sanctuary survived or perished were already begun, and there could be no turning back from the confrontation that was coming with the spring. The confrontation began not with dramatic fanfare, but with the mundane sound of diesel engines laboring up the mountain road that spring had made passable again. Eli heard them long before they came into view, heavy trucks carrying equipment too specialized and expensive to transport by helicopter. The industrial invasion of his sanctuary was beginning with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized every phase of Webb's geological survey. From his hidden observation post above the main access route, Eli watched a convoy of vehicles that spoke of serious commercial intent, survey equipment that would map every passage in the cave system. core drilling rigs designed to extract samples from depths that hand tools could never reach, communications gear that would coordinate activities across multiple sites simultaneously, most ominously, security personnel whose presence suggested that resistance had been anticipated and planned for. Buck lay pressed against Eli's side, his body tense with the controlled alertness of a dog who understood that everything familiar was about to change. The blue-tick hound's years of comfortable retirement had been stripped away by months of wilderness living, revealing instincts that served them well in circumstances where survival depended on reading danger in the smallest details. Buck's nose tested every shift in the wind, cataloguing scents that would tell them who was coming and how many they faced. The lead vehicle stopped at the point where the road became too narrow for trucks, perhaps half a mile below the cave entrance, that Eli and Buck had used for 3 years. Men emerged with the efficient movements of professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Survey markers were placed with GPS precision. Communication equipment was tested and positioned. A base camp began taking shape with modular efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in remote operations. Dr. Webb appeared among the specialists, no longer the lone researcher who had stumbled onto their sanctuary, but now clearly the leader of an expedition backed by serious financial resources. He moved among the equipment with the confidence of someone who had answered every question his corporate sponsors might ask. His preliminary findings had been validated by independent analysis, funding had been secured, and legal obstacles had been cleared for what would become the most significant mineral extraction project in the region's history. The scope of the operation exceeded even Eli's worst fears. This wasn't a small-scale investigation that might be discouraged by determined resistance. It was a full industrial deployment that would transform the mountain, regardless of any obstacles one man might create. The equipment being unloaded could cut through limestone as easily as paper, map underground passages with sonar precision, and extract mineral samples from locations that human exploration could never reach. But as Eli studied the deployment, through field glasses that had served him well during 2 years of careful observation, he began to recognize weaknesses in the operation that might be exploited by someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain. The base camp was positioned for convenience rather than security, vulnerable to approaches that wouldn't appear on any topographical map. The equipment was sophisticated, but dependent on power sources and communication links that could be disrupted by someone willing to move through the wilderness areas that conventional security couldn't monitor. Most importantly, the geological team's understanding of the cave system remained limited to passages that could be accessed through conventional entrances. Webb's surveys had mapped the major chambers and primary routes, but 3 years of daily exploration had revealed connections and alternatives that existed below the threshold of scientific detection. The mountain held secrets that could only be discovered by someone living within its hidden spaces, rather than visiting them with predetermined objectives. The ceramic oil lamp that Eli had fashioned from local clay became his primary source of light as he began moving through passages too narrow and complex for the expedition's equipment to follow. The lamp burned oil rendered from animal fat, producing light that couldn't be detected by electronic sensors and wouldn't reveal his position. To thermal imaging equipment, more than a practical tool, the lamp represented the fundamental difference between his approach and theirs: sustainable technology that worked with natural systems rather than overwhelming them with industrial force. The lamp's steady flame had guided him through countless nights of exploration during their first winter, when understanding the cave system's layout meant the difference between survival and death. Now that same flame would light his way through passages that would determine whether their sanctuary could be defended against forces that measured success in tonnage extracted and profit margins achieved. As darkness fell over the mountain, the expedition's base camp blazed with artificial light that could be seen for miles. Generator-powered floods illuminated work areas where equipment was being prepared for the next day's operations. The contrast between their electric brilliance and his single oil flame captured everything that separated his understanding of the mountain from theirs. Webb's team saw a resource to be exploited efficiently and completely. Eli saw a living system that had supported him through the darkest period of his life and could continue supporting others if protected from destruction. The ceramic lamp in his hands represented 3 years of learning to work with the mountain's natural rhythms rather than against them, creating light and warmth and shelter through methods that left the essential systems intact. The battle for the mountain's future would be decided not by superior firepower or legal authority, but by the depth of understanding that came from choosing to live as part of the landscape rather than imposing human will upon it. The decisive moment came at dawn on the 3rd day, when Webb's team attempted to penetrate the main chamber where Eli and Buck had made their home for 3 years. The geologists approached with confidence, born of technological superiority, carrying equipment that could map underground spaces with precision that made traditional exploration seem primitive. They expected to encounter nothing more challenging than limestone formations and possibly some wildlife that had taken shelter in the caves. What they found instead was evidence of human habitation so extensive and sophisticated that it stopped their advance like a physical barrier. The chamber that had been empty during Webb's initial surveys now revealed itself as a complex living space that spoke of years of careful development. Stone walls that divided the space into functional areas, wooden floors that provided insulation and comfort, storage systems that held everything necessary for long-term survival in complete isolation from the outside world. Buck emerged from a concealed position near the chamber's entrance, his graying muzzle lifted in a growl that conveyed 30 years of accumulated wisdom about distinguishing between friends and threats. The old dog had positioned himself where he could observe the intruders without being immediately detected, and his assessment of their intentions was clearly unfavorable. The blue-tick hound's presence transformed the cave from an empty geological feature into a defended territory where trespassers would face resistance. Dr. Webb stopped at the chamber's threshold, his scientific objectivity overwhelmed by the implications of what he was seeing. The surveys and legal preparations that had brought his team to this point had been based on the assumption that they were dealing with uninhabited wilderness. Discovering evidence of long-term human occupation created complications that threatened the entire project's viability. "This changes everything," Webb said to his colleagues, his voice carrying the weight of someone who realized that months of planning might have to be abandoned. "We can't proceed with mineral extraction if there's an established homestead in the cave system. The environmental impact studies alone would take years to complete, and the legal challenges would be insurmountable." The expedition's security chief, a man whose experience with corporate operations had taught him to expect and plan for resistance, studied the chamber's layout with professional interest. "Whoever set this up knew what they were doing," he observed. "This isn't some homeless camp that can be cleared with a few phone calls. This is a permanent installation that would have legal standing, even if it's technically on public land." Eli stepped into view from a passage that none of Webb's surveys had detected, moving with the quiet confidence of someone entering his own home rather than confronting intruders. Buck moved to his side immediately, the dog's loyalty and protectiveness evident in every line of his aging body. Together, man and dog presented a picture that challenged every assumption the expedition had made about what they would encounter in the mountain's depths. The leather-bound journal that Eli carried represented 3 years of accumulated knowledge about living sustainably in one of the continent's most challenging environments. Every page documented discoveries and innovations that had made their survival possible, techniques for food preservation, methods for creating tools from raw materials, strategies for maintaining health and comfort without access to modern medical care. The journal was proof that human beings could thrive in landscapes that industrial civilization considered worthless except for mineral extraction. "Mr. Turner," Webb said, recognition and resignation combining in his voice, "I should have known you'd found a way to survive up here. Your family has been searching for you for 3 years. They believe you died in the fire." The weight of those words settled over the chamber like smoke from their evening fires. Eli understood that his choice to remain hidden had consequences that extended far beyond his personal desire for independence. Sarah and James had mourned him as dead while he was creating a new life just miles from the ruins of their family home. The guilt of causing such pain warred with the certainty that revealing his survival would mean the end of everything he'd built. "This doesn't have to be complicated," the security chief interjected, his tone suggesting solutions that had nothing to do with legal niceties or environmental concerns. "One old man and a dog can't stop a project this size. There are ways to handle situations like this without creating publicity problems." Buck's growl deepened at the implied threat, and Eli felt his own resolve hardening into something that surprised him with its intensity. The journal in his hands contained more than survival techniques. It held proof that alternatives to industrial exploitation were not only possible, but superior in every way that mattered. The sustainable abundance they had created would be destroyed by mining operations that would exhaust the mountain's wealth in decades and leave behind environmental damage that would persist for centuries. "You're looking at this mountain as a resource to be consumed," Eli said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the landscape he defended. "I see it as a home that has room for everyone if we're willing to live within its natural limits." The confrontation that would determine the mountain's future had begun, and there could be no compromise between visions so fundamentally opposed. The resolution came not through violence or legal maneuvering, but through a revelation that changed everything both sides thought they understood about the mountain's true value. As Webb's expedition prepared to withdraw and regroup for what promised to be a prolonged legal battle, Sarah Turner arrived at the base camp with news that transformed the entire situation. She had been searching for her father for 3 years, following every lead and investigating every report of hermits or survivalists living in the high country. Webb's geological survey had finally provided the breakthrough she needed, not through his mineral discoveries, but through his mention of encountering a man and dog living in the cave system. Sarah had driven through the night to reach the mountain, hoping against hope that the mystery inhabitant might be the father she had mourned as dead. The reunion between father and daughter took place in the chamber that had been Eli's home for 3 years. Witnessed by Buck's enthusiastic welcome of a family member, he remembered despite the passage of time. Sarah's shock at seeing what her father had built was complete and transformative. The comfortable living space carved from limestone, the sophisticated systems for water and waste management, the workshop where hand tools created furniture of museum quality, all of it spoke of accomplishment rather than mere survival. "Dad," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she took in the scope of what he had achieved. "We thought you were dead. We held a memorial service. James came all the way from California to say goodbye to you." The family Bible that Eli had salvaged from the cabin's ruins and carefully restored during the long winter evenings became the bridge between his old life and the new understanding that Sarah was struggling to process. The book's fire-damaged pages had been painstakingly separated and pressed flat, its leather binding repaired with skills learned from traditional craftsmen who had valued books as treasures rather than disposable commodities. In the Bible's restored pages, Sarah could see the love and patience that had motivated her father's choice to remain hidden rather than return to a world that would have demanded he live according to other people's expectations. Every carefully mended page represented hours of work performed not from necessity, but from devotion to something that connected him to family traditions and spiritual foundations that industrial society had largely abandoned. "I couldn't come." "Aback," Eli explained, his weathered hands gentle on the Bible's restored binding. "Not to be told I was too old to live as I chose, too stubborn to accept help I didn't need, too set in my ways to adapt to changes I didn't want. This mountain gave me the chance to discover what I was truly capable of when everything else was stripped away." Dr. Webb found himself in the unexpected position of witnessing a family reconciliation that would determine his project's fate more decisively than any environmental impact study or legal challenge. Sarah's obvious amazement at her father's accomplishments was forcing the geologist to reconsider his assumptions about the cave system's value. The mineral wealth buried in the limestone was undeniably significant, but the human achievement represented by Eli's mountain sanctuary might prove more valuable in ways that corporate accounting systems couldn't measure. "What you've built here is extraordinary," Webb admitted, his scientific training compelling him to acknowledge evidence even when it contradicted his preconceptions. "This represents a level of sustainable living that universities spend millions trying to research and demonstrate. You've created a working model of human adaptation that could teach us more about environmental harmony than any mineral extraction project could ever justify." The security chief's objections were overruled by forces beyond his authority to control. Sarah Turner was not an anonymous hermit who could be relocated without public attention. She was a respected member of the Denver community whose search for her missing father had attracted media coverage and political support. More importantly, her father's mountain sanctuary represented exactly the kind of environmental success story that could generate positive publicity worth far more than any mineral deposits. Buck settled beside the fire that had warmed them through 3 years of mountain winters, his contentment evident in every line of his aging body. The old dog understood that the crisis was over, that the family pack was being restored, and that the security of their mountain home was no longer threatened. His loyalty had been rewarded with the return of loved ones he had never forgotten, and the sanctuary he had helped defend would continue to provide refuge for whoever needed its protection. The compromise that emerged from the confrontation satisfied everyone's essential needs while protecting what mattered most. Webb's geological surveys would continue, but as part of a research program designed to understand sustainable resource management rather than extractive exploitation. The cave system would be designated as a living laboratory where traditional skills could be demonstrated and taught to students interested in learning alternatives to industrial consumption. Sarah's decision to spend part of each year at the mountain sanctuary surprised everyone, including herself. The daughter who had wanted her father to move to the city discovered that she needed what the mountain offered: connection to natural rhythms, freedom from constant digital stimulation, and the deep satisfaction that came from creating necessary things with her own hands. The family Bible that had survived fire and restoration now held a place of honor in their mountain home, its presence connecting them to ancestors who had faced similar challenges and prevailed through faith, determination, and willingness to adapt when circumstances demanded change. The book's pages, carefully preserved and lovingly maintained, would outlast the mining equipment that had threatened to destroy their sanctuary. As autumn returned to the high country and the first snows dusted the peaks that surrounded their cave, Eli Turner stood on the familiar ledge where he had watched so many sunrises during his years of solitude. Buck pressed against his legs with the contentment of a dog whose pack was complete, while Sarah worked in the garden that would feed them through another mountain winter. The mountain had tested them with fire and flood, isolation and invasion, But it had also taught them that some kinds of wealth couldn't be extracted or consumed, only shared with those wise enough to recognize their true value. In learning to live within the mountain's natural limits, they had discovered abundance that would last as long as they had the wisdom to preserve it.